in some ways, there's an argument to be made that if you want to end the genocide, you actually should vote for Trump.
I had introduced you, or at least to the audience, as a historian of Palestine, simply. But if you would, please, if you could describe a little bit of your history, like where you're coming from. What made you want to decide to study the history of Palestine and Israel, as well as the region, conflict, occupation, however you want to describe it?
Sure thing. So I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, going to Jewish schools, Jewish summer camps, Jewish youth groups. That got me interested in Judaism and also Israel. I mean, as you well know, American Judaism could be better described as Israelism. The state became a religion among American Jews. There's actually a documentary about it that has been making the rounds. And the documentary is called Israelism. So I grew up in this environment where Israel was the center of the religion that I grew up with. And so that got me interested in Israel, obviously. And just being the curious person I was, actually visiting the country, meeting Palestinians, traveling around Israel and Palestine, just got much more curious in the Palestinian people and Palestinian history. And I think what happens when you start to study Israeli history, and Palestinian history, you're exposed to a very different narrative than the one you would be raised with if you grew up in my kind of environment. And so actually it was first the contact with Palestinians that got me curious, but then it was actually reading the history that got me more interested in sort of the Israel-Palestine question. And I think, just to summarize a lot of history in just standing on just one foot, the more of the history of Zionism that you read, the more pro-Palestine you become. The Zionist community was faced with a problem from day one, which is how do you create a Jewish country in a land that is 95% non-Jewish? And that's a problem.
Yeah, you've got to try and do a tandem of not only your understanding of Zionism as you're growing up, but then was there a time that it switched, or was it kind of like a coming to grips with things, through your studies?
It's a process. It didn't happen overnight. There were a few key turning points, the first of which was spending a semester in Jerusalem as an undergraduate student, a semester abroad at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which is on Mount Scopus, which is basically a divided neighborhood. It's sort of half Palestinian, half Jewish. At least French Hill which is where I was staying. So you are constantly being exposed to a Palestinian culture, Arab culture, the Arabic language. It just got me curious, right? So that it started from a point of curiosity. Then studying Hebrew with Palestinians, who are also learning Hebrew for similar reasons that I'm learning Hebrew, is to be able to use the language in a professional setting, and so I started to do language exchanges with Palestinians, Hebrew language exchanges with Palestinians. That was another turning point. Got me more interested in Palestinian culture and Palestinian history and Palestinian society. And again, I was coming from a starting point of all these people are terrorists, right? Like that's the narrative you grow up with. Is like these people, they just want to kill you. You don't know anything about them other than the fact that they want to kill you, which obviously quickly proved to be false. So already I was sort of like, wait, hold on. These people are actually really interesting and fun and nice. Like, I was clearly raised with a lot of mythology. So this is I'm kind of learning this in real time. But then I think the more significant turning point for me personally was spending about 4 weeks in the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and Kosovo, with a group of half Jewish Americans, half Palestinian Americans. The program is now defunct. At the time, it was called Abraham's Vision. But basically, we traveled around the Balkans, trying to study the conflicts in the Balkans as a kind of a comparative conflict analysis program. In other words, let's abstract away the particular case of Israel and Palestine and try to understand how ethnic groups, are in conflict around the world. What are the issues that are dividing them? Why are they killing each other in the Balkans? Why are Serbs in Bosnia, in Srebrenica in the 90s, why do they massacre, 8,000 Muslims in a crime that later came to be described as genocide by the UN? What's going on in Bosnia? Why are they slaughtering each other? Oh, I see. So there are these dynamics and conflicts that play out. Similar dynamics in the Balkans. in Israel and Palestine, in Northern Ireland, right, in all these places around the world. And so that helps us understand, kind of like de-exceptionalize our case in Israel and Palestine. So that was another key turning point. But more significantly, it was the conversations we were having between the Jews and the Palestinians. Right here, you have these Palestinians saying, look, our parents and grandparents are from Palestine. We speak Arabic. We have family in the country. We have deep roots in the country. We want to return, but we can't. You, as an American Jew who doesn't speak a word of Arabic or Hebrew, who has no family in the country, who may not have ever even heard of the country, you can go tomorrow and get a passport and live there. So that just didn't make any sense to me either. And that led me to study more and read more, and then it was just a process of like actually just reading the history, of reading Ilan Pappé, of reading Benny Morris, of reading Avi Shleim, of reading Nur Masalha, of reading Rashid Khalidi, of reading all of these historians writing about the history as the historians tell it, which is very upsetting. It's a very, if you're a Zionist and a believer in the ideology of Zionism, it will be very traumatizing to learn that all of these Zionist leaders were obsessed with the question of what to do with the Arabs, and they all landed on basically the same answers. They have to go. We have to expel them. And for me, that was kind of the beginning of the end of my view that as a Zionist.
Yeah. And so, bringing it to today, and you're calling from the West Bank now. Can you kind of describe what the conditions are like, and as well too as like any previous times you've been to Palestine versus what it's like now?
Look, the West Bank right now, I mean, when we say Palestine, we mean you could mean different things, right? You could mean all of historic Palestine, basically everything between the river and the sea. What is today the West Bank, Gaza, Israel proper, or when some people use the word Palestine just to refer to the occupied Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Look, in the West Bank right now, it's, it should be really considered the third Intifada, because we're seeing more violence in the West Bank in the past 7-8 months than we have in previous Intifadas. More than 500 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed in the past 7-8 months since the 7th of October. In fact, there's a strike today in Ramallah. All the shops are closed. Why? Because there were 4 martyrs that were slaughtered last night by the Israeli military. And this happens whenever the Israeli military comes into Ramallah or the villages surrounding Ramallah and goes in and kills however many Palestinians. You get strikes in Ramallah the next day. You've had some communities, mostly shepherding communities, ethnically cleansed from various parts of the West Bank, particularly the Jordan Valley. Places like Masaf al-Yatta in the south, the Hebron Hills, places like Khan al-Ahmar in the E1 zone, places like Khumsa in the north of the West Bank. So all around the West Bank, there are communities being ethnically cleansed in real time. So every couple of weeks, another community is ethnically cleansed. What do I mean by ethnically cleansed? They have been living, these Palestinians have been living in a certain community for decades. They get, over the past 7 months, these operations by the settlers, the Israeli settlers, have accelerated. They'll enter the village, harass Palestinians, slash the tires on their cars. They go out to the pastures with their flocks of sheep. The settlers come and harass the flocks to disperse them. They enter the villages. They'll sit on the couch of a Palestinian home in Khumsa. They'll literally enter their home, sit on and take their morning coffee in the couch of the Palestinians' home. And
these are not only just Israeli citizens, and they proudly proclaim themselves as settlers, but we've seen that this is like also getting support from the police, Israeli police, as well as the IDF. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. They have the full support of the Israeli military. Whenever they enter Palestinian villages, the Israeli military are not far behind. In many cases, the Israeli military are standing by, waiting to protect them in case in case the Palestinians try to defend themselves. More than I believe settlers. So we're talking about civilians. I mean, I'm not even sure it's really fair to even call these people civilians, because they're in and out of the army themselves in reserve duty. They themselves wear Israeli military garb. They're carrying assault rifles on their backs. Okay, and they're going and harassing Palestinians. So they themselves are failing to distinguish themselves from the Israeli military, which kind of makes them a military target in some ways. But they're entering the Palestinian villages. intimidation, violence, harassment. More than a dozen Palestinians have been killed by Israeli settlers since the 7th of October, in addition to the 500 killed by the Israeli military. So they're committing pogroms in Hawara. On October 5th, 2 days before October 7th, you had hundreds of Israeli settlers enter the Palestinian town of Hawara, torching cars, blowing up homes, killing one Palestinian, injuring dozens. I mean, just a massive amount of violence, all with the full support of the Israeli military, which is, again, run by a fascist government. I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that understands who is in charge in the state of Israel. It's fascists. It's Netanyahu is the progressive. Netanyahu, the guy who said he's the progressive member of the coalition.
I know there's a Gallant that just left the war cabinet, and they're describing him as a centrist, which is like this the same guy that said we're going to shut off all the water and all the electricity and refer to Palestinians as human animals. Classic centrist, behavior, I'd say. But something I'd like to go back to. I mean, the attacks, the response, just like the resistance as a third Intifada. Could you go into not just historically the first and second, but what do you mean? Because there's been a lot of protests. I've been a part of a few of them, and a lot of these chants become more of a focus than ethnic cleansing or genocide. What does Intifada mean? It's
an Arabic word that means rising up. And it was first used in the case of Palestine. You could say actually already in the 1930s, but let's just say, the way it's typically used in, let's say, modern Palestinian Arabic, to refer to basically two periods of time from late 1987 until 1993. That was known as the first uprising, the first Intifada, during which time the Israeli military killed about 1,200 Palestinians, and Palestinians killed about 100 some Israelis. The Palestinians killed are overwhelmingly civilians. In fact, a majority of whom are children. Not a majority, but a huge percentage of whom are children. While the Israeli deaths are actually mostly military personnel. So actually, and by the way, in the first year of that Intifada, so like when it first got started, in the first year alone, in Gaza, the Israeli military killed 142 Palestinians and suffered 0 casualties. So Intifada, and then eventually Palestinians started resorting to violence because they were being slaughtered, because violence breeds violence. But if you really think about at the root cause of this Intifada was a peaceful uprising. I mean, Intifada really signifies Israeli violence against Palestinians.
Yeah, it starts out as a strike, as peaceful protests, as the ability for groups of individuals to speak out and protest their government. There's a country out there that stands on that type of talk quite a bit. It doesn't seem to really back it up. You'd reiterated that, right now there's shops are closed down because of the increased settler violence. I guess it was like, as of right now, how do you fit yourself in all of this? Is there any increased targeting towards you as you began to kind of go on this journey? Was there any strife throughout, like the connections you have made throughout your life, your family, and everything like that? Or were you able to even convince some people of, hey, this is wrong? And then also, what is it like now being in the West Bank?
I think for me, the key has been to equip myself with facts. And I think the more facts you have, the more you understand why people are killing each other here, the better you are equipped to be able to convince people around you that what Israel has been doing for decades and decades and decades is a crime against humanity, right? We said the reason Palestinians rose up in the first Intifada was because for the previous 20 years, from 1967 to 1987, the Israeli military is killing 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years. They're imposing checkpoints, and they're arresting tens of thousands of Palestinians for political reasons. They haven't committed any crimes. They haven't done any violence. They're just, waving Palestinian flags or using the name Palestine in an organization, or painting a painting using red, green, black, and white. That got Fatah in 1982. That landed him in prison for 6 months because he painted a painting using the wrong 4 colors. So Palestinians are being denied basic rights for 20 years. They're being denied the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. It's an occupation. They don't have rights.
And this is even... I've seen some reports and videos of Israeli Jewish citizens who would assume to have all full rights can't post "Pray for the children." I think is some of the even most sanitized nondescript language, and they're being taken into prison. It's your day-to-day life. Do you have to go through the checkpoints and everything like that? For me, it's a very surreal type of thing to be a black man in America and learn about systemic racism in a very sanitized neoliberal sense, and then to relearn the truth and the project of the United States and what are the goals of this project, what are the results of it, and, you know, indigenous genocide and the chattel slavery and going on and all the civil rights movement and the repression that comes back with the Red Scare. You go through all of these things, but as of right now in my life, I'm still able to move about. It's very hard for me to even understand how this could, you know, how the world was so blind to everything. If you could, as best you can, describe what does that look like on the ground? What does it feel like? You know, especially like you came from Detroit, so, you know, if you go like a back and forth.
Yeah, totally. So the West Bank is a highly militarized space. Okay, there's 180 some Israeli Jewish settlements scattered about on the hilltops. Some of them are entire neighbor. I mean, some of them are basically cities, right? Ariel is a city of 40,000 people. And then you have so you have about 600, 700,000 Israeli settlers who vote for the government. They have full rights in Israel. They're Israeli citizens. They can move in and out of Israel as they like between Israel and the West Bank. They obviously, have healthcare in Israel. They vote for the Israeli government, etc. They're just as Israeli as any other Israeli. In fact, many of the ministers in the government live in the settlements, right? Then you have 3 million Palestinians. Those 3 million Palestinians live divided between three areas: Area A, B, and C. This is a kind of an outcome of the Oslo process, right? This quote unquote peace process between Israel and the Palestinians starting from '93. Which, let's just put a pin in that, and we can talk about that later if you want. But basically, the result of this process led to these three different zones in the West Bank. In Area A, Palestinians is about 20% of the West Bank. It's the basically urban West Bank. Palestinians nominally have control over sort of internal affairs of these urban centers. So, street cleaning, garbage collection, policing the streets, issuing, building permits, the healthcare, the education system, etc. Right? But the Israeli army enters these areas whenever it wants, and since October 7th, they enter on a daily basis, almost in every area A of the West Bank. We're talking about nightly raids. Israel loves to carry out its crimes at night because it doesn't want cameras. It doesn't want people waiting around watching, filming everything. It wants to do things quietly at night, which is why, by the way, Israel also bombs Gaza at night. Israel demolishes homes oftentimes at night. It carries out raids in the West Bank at night. Anyways, so that's Area A, where you have the Israeli army. Like I said, they just entered a village right around Ramallah yesterday, killing 4 Palestinians. But this is a daily occurrence. Then you have Area B. Area B is sort of basically Israeli security control, Palestinian civilian control. And then Area C is full Israeli control. Now in Area C, which is, by the way, Area C is 60% of the West Bank, you are 100 times more likely to be issued a demolition order on your home than you are to be issued a permit to build a home. So you're not allowed to build as a Palestinian, and what you've already built is going to likely be demolished. Why? Because Israel wants to take over all Area C. That's basically the goal. Because why? Why does Israel want to take over Area C? Well, because it's 60% of the West Bank, but it only has 100,000 Palestinians living in it, right? So that's the goal of Zionism, right? We want the land, but not the people living on it. This is just classic settler colonial ideology. You of course want the land, you want the resources, you want the water, you want the hilltops, you want the strategic positions, you want a fertile land, but of course you don't want the people living on it. So that's why Area C is the most aggressive. That's why settlers and the Israeli military is the most aggressive. Literally, in places like Masaf Yatta, the settlers enter every day. I was just there a few days ago. There were violent settlers coming in, harassing Palestinians. So Area C is
some police forces, some Palestinian police forces. What's the dynamic once settlers, IDF, Palestinian police? What occurs there?
So the Palestinians are essentially always incredibly nonviolent, because as soon as if a Palestinian in Area C literally puts his finger on the shoulder of an Israeli, he'll be arrested and thrown in prison, considered an administrative detainee, and without having been charged with anything, he will be locked up indefinitely, which can be renewed forever. And by the way, that's why now increasingly more and more people are talking about them as hostages, because they're not told why they're arrested. So they can't provide a legal defense because they don't know what to defend themselves against. Their crime is a secret. And then their detention is renewable indefinitely forever. So every 6 months, a judge just says, okay, renew it for another 6 months, and that can happen literally forever. And in many cases, that does happen for decades. So the Palestinians just kind of stand by and sort of plead with the Israeli settlers and soldiers, please, can you please stop harassing me? Please get off my land, almost like pleading with your master, please don't hurt me. And that's what these interactions are like.
And the Palestinian
really,
police have no recourse. The same type of thing, except they might have like a nightstick or something, but they're essentially just begging for a decrease in the violence.
Well, in Area C, there is no Palestinian police. Recall, because in areas B and C, which is again 80% of the West Bank, Israel is
is everything.
The sovereign.
Yeah,
Israel has security control. It's Israeli military police who are the ones. If you're a Palestinian in Area B or C, and like someone carries out violence against you, you call the Israeli military, the people who are defending and supporting and funding the people carrying out the violence.
Yeah. So this is something that I'm very happy that you kind of like gone through and explained what's going on in the West Bank, because for obvious reasons there hasn't been a lot of a focus, but what's happening in the West Bank I think alludes greater towards like what is actually the goal of the Israeli government. Is peace, the idea of like destroying Hamas, but Hamas does not operate in the West Bank. And yet you see, right, all these, not only just, increased violence since October 7th, but there was already a sense of increased violence before. But moving into, I guess, like the greater situation to involve ethnic cleansing and genocide in the Gaza Strip, the tensions with Hezbollah in the north, and now we see the UN Security Council seemingly passing what Hamas had I think was their offer around Ramadan, was kind of this tiered ceasefire, and from my understanding it seems that the one linchpin is the permanence of the ceasefire, in which case the Israeli government is willing to support a temporary one but absolutely refuses to sign anything that involves a permanent ceasefire. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I think you summarized it accurately. That is the crux of the issue. It's that in phase 2, right? So phase 1, there would be, I guess, an exchange. There would be sort of a pause in fighting, a temporary ceasefire. Phase 2, you'd have some, or I forget exactly when the first round of hostages would, so then there'd be an exchange of hostages and prisoners. And then they would take a 6-week period to basically negotiate a kind of a final ceasefire resolution, right? Now, the point of difference between, Hamas and Israel is that for Israel, if they don't reach an agreement within 6 weeks, then the fighting resumes, the genocide continues. For Hamas, it's that, the ceasefire continues until we reach an agreement. But the point is, Israel, in other words, is willing to agree to 6 weeks of a 6-week pause in the fighting, and that's it. They're not willing to agree to a ceasefire.
And this is something that was an amazing feat of insincerity when Joe Biden announces, quote unquote, this supposed Israeli plan that within minutes, you've got members of the cabinet saying, they're not going to sign on to it. Right now, Hamas has said they're supportive of the UN Security Council vote that just happened yesterday, willing to engage in negotiations, but as we see, the Israeli government, so is not willing to accept. My question, and this is kind of maybe like going outside of like your job as a historian to like document and memorize, but I want to see if you might extrapolate, see like where do you see things in a historical context with the state of Israel as a rational international community is obviously seeing it in a different light. Can you think back at any other times that Israel as a nation has been such a pariah on the national stage, and where do you think this leads?
Genocide is one of those crimes that doesn't really go away. So long as the current Israeli government or the current coalition, the political parties in Israel that are currently in the governing coalition, you're talking about 7 or 8 political parties, as long as they're still in power in Israel, and they will still have, they will still be basically, um, perpetrators of a genocide indefinitely. The crime doesn't. There's no statute of limitations. The ICJ could prosecute, Gantz and Netanyahu 15 years from now, 20 years from now, should they eventually determine it's a genocide, right? Or should the ICC determine that Israel has carried out, war crimes? So these crimes don't go away. This is the beginning of a completely new phase in the Israel-Palestine question. Historians like turning points. They like chapters.
Mm-hmm.
This is a new chapter. The state of Israel that we knew from 1948 to October 6, 2023 is going to be a different state of Israel than the one that we know from October 7th to the present. Increasingly, this state will be a pariah state, just like Iran, just like Russia, just like North Korea. It is placing itself in that category of countries.
And now, where does the United States fit in? Because the big difference between Iran, Russia, North Korea is that, those are on the other side of the world police. So, yeah, if you could even extrapolate past, Israel, what do you think of United States geopolitical relations as it's attaching itself to one of the pariah states?
I mean, it sort of speaks to the crumbling of this global world order that we've known and loved and hated for however many decades. I mean, this idea of the rules-based world order, this idea that the United States is some kind of moral authority in the world, this idea that we have moral leadership, this idea that countries should do what we say because, we're the world's policemen and, we stand on the side of democracy and freedom and human rights. I mean, that is now a fiction for everyone. No serious human being can actually believe that anymore. So I really think we're witnessing. So I think Gaza has become a kind of a canary in the coal mine a little bit. It's a kind of a red herring for the world to come, which is there isn't the world order as we've known it for however many decades. I mean, there's obviously many independent journalists and many free thinkers and many people who have rejected this idea that the United States is some kind of beacon for freedom and democracy for decades. I mean, we all recall the Iraq War where the U.S. illegally invaded and occupied a foreign country, right? Kind of similar to what Russia's doing to Ukraine right now. So, people who have been kind of not in the Washington blob, I've known this for decades.
Yeah.
But now I think it has become painfully obvious to everyone. So it's a new world order.
And something that, I think it's, kind of sticks out is the votes in the UN. Obviously, international law is about as real as the air that I just grabbed. Seeing countries like Japan, South Korea, very deeply entrenched, so it's a clientele states of the United States that were kind of started voting against the United States' wishes in the UN as it pertains to Gaza. And that new world order that you mentioned, do countries just look to China for stability? Does Brazil, what is the possibility for, other large resource-heavy nation states to be able to provide some sort of stability? But, I guess my fear is the candle in the wind that is 600 military bases spread out across the globe. And seemingly the United States is the one industry that it is definitely going to prop up and is doing now is the military industry and the ability to just create more artillery shells to continue on a lot of these conflicts. But I appreciate you going out of the historian box a little bit and kind of projecting forward. But as far as things are happening, kind of going back into the dynamics of right now. The history of Hamas, I think, is getting more and more understood as far as where it's coming out of Netanyahu and extracting the Likud party that supporting of Hamas is the way to go so that we can drive a wedge. If you could kind of do a quick overview of some of the dynamics of the major political players with the Palestinians and what's the ability of any trajectory of them being able to politically reform, even if against some of the best hopes of the Israeli government? Yeah,
so, I mean, should I start this story kind of in the 70s and 80s, or do you want me to talk about the current political landscape?
Well, if you could start in the 70s and 80s, just kind of give some background, but then what are the political players of the day, and what are any options that might, be able to allow Palestinians to, solidify a political presence, to secure their own, livelihood?
Gotcha. Well, look, you could say that the story with Hamas begins when Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza, really beginning in 1967, right? Because occupation breeds resistance, because violence breeds violence. And so after 20 years of violent military occupation, you get this, this organization called Hamas, which, adopts its charter that calls for establishment of an Islamic State in all of Palestine beginning in 1988. But before 1988 or before 1987, that same organization was actually known as the Islamic Collective. It was a charity. It was an Islamic charity that focused on, Islamic preaching and social services. They funded orphanages and schools and after-school programming for children, women's empowerment. So that organization
sounds awful. That sounds terrible. No.
It was actually funded and supported by the state of Israel, right? Because the same logic that has led Israel to try and drive a wedge between Fatah and Hamas today, the same logic was used in the 1980s to try and drive a wedge between to try and undermine the PLO, which was what Israel thought at the time was its main adversary. So in order to try and undermine the PLO, Israel funded the predecessor to Hamas, which was known as Al-Mujamma al-Islami. So in any case, the organization, basically after Israel violently puts down this uprising, this peaceful uprising, this organization transitions into, a more of a militant organization, starts to pick up arms, starts to carry out attacks against Israel, and continues to do so. Really, I would say, all the way to the present. So that's Hamas. You also have basically the other major political party in Palestine is Fatah. That's the party of Mahmoud Abbas. Right, Mahmoud Abbas being the predecessor of Yasser Arafat, who kind of ruled the PLO and Fatah for decades and decades. After he died in 2003, there were elections. Abbas won, and he's basically been the president of Palestine for the past 15, 16 years. He has not held elections. 90% of Palestinians think he should resign. He's usually, by most Palestinians, considered to be part of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, rather than representing some kind of resistance to it. So those are the two main political parties. Fatah, a kind of, basically these days you could call it Israel's occupation subcontractor in the West Bank. That's Fatah. A collaborationist government. Every time the Israeli military enters Palestinian towns and villages and refugee camps to kill Palestinians, they always tell Fatah in advance. Right? They always tell the Palestinian Authority in advance. So they're complicit in Israel's violence and Israel's apartheid. They're very much complicit. So that's Fatah. And then you have Hamas. Hamas being this militant resistance organization which won free and fair democratic elections in 2006. And then from 2006 to 2007, basically the United States and Israel said to Fatah, they said to Mahmoud Abbas, you either form an emergency government without Hamas, or we cut off funding. They said, and so this is classic U.S. foreign policy: is you promote democracy, except when you don't like who wins the elections, and then you undermine the democracy, and then you support autocracy, which is what the U.S. has in the West Bank. So basically, those are the two political parts. So then, Hamas won the election. They obviously Fatah and the U.S. tried to undercut them, undermine them. And then and that led to this kind of clash, this sort of a civil war in Gaza in the summer of 2007, in which Hamas won and took power in the Gaza Strip, which led Israel to impose a full blockade on the Gaza Strip, which kind of led to sort of that's sort of the backdrop to October 7th, is you have 2 million people living in Gaza who have been blockaded off from the world, who are being besieged, which is an act of war for 16 years, and 80% of whom are now, they need food aid because you can't have an economy when you're being blockaded. So there's no economy to speak of in Gaza, and so 80% of the population is dependent on food handouts. And then they cut off the food handouts, and that's why there's a famine in Gaza today. So that's kind of the landscape right now. And then to the question of kind of where do we go from here? What's the hope for a sort of a Palestinian, what is the future of the Palestinian people? I mean, I hate to be so pessimistic, Marcus, but it's very bleak. I mean, it's very, very bleak.
As you say, there's like a lack of political organization that's actually dedicated, or at least even marginally dedicated, to advancing Palestinian rights and actually securing some type of livelihood. But the amount of Palestinians in Israeli military prison and the good amount of actual resistance leaders, peaceful and or not, that I wonder like how many similarities are to some of the targeting of like the FBI on black revolutionaries. And what that does to a movement, and it leaves it leaderless, like directionless, and exposed to corrupt officials. I guess is that basically where we're at right now?
Yeah, I would say Israel has done everything in its power to suppress nonviolent Palestinian resistance. Okay, so over the past 20 years, you've had many, many, many cases of Palestinian nonviolent resistance. So starting from the early 2000s, in 2002, Israel started building a wall. As you probably seen images of it, it basically, like classic solution. We're getting attacked. Let's build a wall. That'll solve our problems. So they built this wall, which is 90% of which is built inside the West Bank, confiscating all this West Bank land. Like 12% of the land in the West Bank, the agricultural land, has been basically annexed. It's on the other side of, it's on the Israeli side of the wall, even though it's in the West Bank. And there were protest movements throughout the early 2000s. Against the construction of the wall in all of these villages that had their land confiscated. And in every case, the Palestinians would protest. And I've been to dozens of these protests. They're always nonviolent. It's a kid throwing a stone at a tank, right? That's basically what, it's basically people waving flags, chanting, end the occupation. And the Israeli military just spraying people with rubber bullets, firing tear gas canisters at point-blank range at people's chests, and using all kinds of grotesque violence, killing dozens and dozens of Palestinians over the years in nonviolent resistance. Then you have, the Gaza March of the Living protests, or excuse me, in 2018, 2019.
It was a March to Return? Was it?
Yes, the March of Return, thank you. You have tens of thousands of Palestinians. Look at the images. There were Gandhian-style marches, peaceful protesters, waving Palestinian flags, demanding freedom, demanding equality, demanding a right to return to their homes that they were violently expelled from in 1948. And what did the Israeli military do? They slaughtered them. They targeted journalists. They targeted medics. And they targeted children. On one day alone, on May 14th, 2018, Israeli snipers they slaughtered 60 unarmed Palestinian protesters. It was a massacre. And what did the United States and Israel do? On the same day, that very same day, on May 14th, 2018, you had Israeli, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, celebrating the U.S. embassy's move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, effectively celebrating Israel's illegal annexation of East Jerusalem on the same day that Israel is slaughtering unarmed Palestinians. And then, just one last point. In 2021, Israel declared 6 Palestinian human rights organizations the most nonviolent form of all nonviolent forms of resistance, right? Because you're literally you're a keyboard resistor. You're just typing up reports in a fucking office.
Just saying that they did this. They did this. That's
they were declared terrorists.
Yeah.
So what happens when you shut down all forms of nonviolent resistance? What happens? Take a guess.
And this is something that it is somewhat shocking, because the missile strike that blew up the AP offices, what year was that?
Well, Israel blew up the offices of, I believe, AP as well as Al Jazeera in 2021, in the May 2021 war.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the object permanence or the lack thereof in the Western media, these types of things just kind of get looked over as some type of like accident, in a very similar way of the way the U.S. foreign policy assumed it's like, oh, there goes the bumbling giant again, and you slipped and fell on Afghanistan. Oh, that silly giant, but these are deliberate actions that are taken, indiscriminately, of sovereignty, life, any type of liberty, freedom, all the blah, blah, blah stuff. Speaking of resistance movement, flipping it into the Israeli citizenry, not only like the protesters, but different factions of protesters, because you see, as some people who are very against the Netanyahu continuing the war, and these are largely coming from like the families of the hostages. But also there are like more violent right-wing factions of just, fascist gangs that are also trying to even suppress that type of thing to continue the war. So can you explain any dynamics that are kind of going on there?
Yeah. So I think it's worth emphasizing first that most Jewish Israelis support the war. Okay. In a January 2024 a poll, something like 95% of Jewish Israelis believed there was either the right amount of force being used in Gaza. This is after 25,000 Palestinians had already been killed, maybe already almost 30,000 by that point, or not enough force was being used in Gaza. So that's 95% of Jewish Israelis as of January. Now it's June, we're 6 months later. I imagine, I haven't seen more recent polling than that, but at least on that specific question, I imagine that percentage has come down. There's certainly an increasing number of Jewish Israelis that have come to the realization that the only way you bring home the hostages is with a ceasefire. And so out of their desire to bring home the hostages, they're supporting a ceasefire. But again, we're still talking about a relatively small minority of Jewish Israelis. The vast majority of them, I don't know if it's 60% or 70 or 80%, but the majority of Jewish Israelis are broadly speaking supportive of the war. That is the war. What are the aims of the war? To totally eliminate Hamas. At least that's the stated aim. We all know what the real aim is. It's to ethnically cleanse all 2.2 million Palestinians from Gaza and hopefully either to North Sinai, or they can get on ships built by the American and shipped off by the American pier, or maybe they'll or just die, or just die of either starvation or disease or violence or a bomb or some other or an Israeli tank shell or an Israeli sniper or an Israeli drone copter or some other form of Israeli violence, but ultimately that's the goal. Most Israelis are broadly speaking in support of that. Now, there has been some protests, especially in the past few months. Increasingly, like I said, the realization is if you want to bring home the hostages, you got to end the war. And so, there is an obsession with the hostages in Israeli Jewish society, right? Like wherever you go, any public square, you enter into the airport, you turn on the TV. It doesn't matter where you go. The pictures of the hostages are plastered everywhere, literally everywhere. And by the way, it's not just in Israel; it's also Jewish communities all around the world. You go to a synagogue in Panama. You go to a synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio. You go to Jewish communities everywhere around the world. It's the same obsession with the hostages. They almost become a kind of national symbol of the state of Israel. And that's obviously all the more so true of Jewish Israeli society. The one thing I would say about Palestinian Arab society is that obviously it's very different. Perspectives are very different. But Palestinian Israelis are very afraid of losing their jobs, of being fired, of being suspended from university, because of course many hundreds have been fired from their jobs for innocuous social media posts like free Gaza or stop bombing Gaza. That will get you fired in Israel. But that will get you suspended from university. That will get you debarred your law degree. You will no longer be able to practice law. So that's a real fear for Palestinians in Israel. That their livelihoods are at risk if they speak out politically. This is not a free country. You don't just get to say whatever you want. It's a censored country. There's a military censor. Everything that gets published in any Israeli press outlet has to get approval by the Israeli military before it publishes it. So,
Which,
of course,
also on that note, like CNN, MSNBC have admitted to that most of the earlier on stuff, especially, was completely filtered through an Israeli office, an Israeli government office, as to what they were allowed to air. CNN has gone away; they've actually branched out and surprisingly done pretty good, stories. But as of right now, there is no allowed media into the Gaza Strip. And Israel has completely pushed out Al Jazeera. They're not allowed to report in Israel, and no Western media, no media at all, is allowed. It kind of is a very disgusting, rhetorical thing that keeps getting said in the West of like the only democracy in the Middle East, as if a democracy was a requirement for support. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is the number one buyer, purchaser of U.S. weapons. So these things are very nonsensical, also not true. The dynamics of this Saudi Arabia, Abraham Accords, making this deal. And this is where it's like, I think with many different foreign policy aspects, the Biden administration is stuck in the late 70s, early 80s. And it seems as if this Saudi deal, even though started by Trump and corruptly, maybe by his son-in-law Jared Kushner getting $2 billion right before they're leaving, it seems as if this is they are trying to, I guess, make this as you're saying, historians like a turning point. They're trying to make this deal a turning point, to further the establishment of the nation state of Israel as it normalizes these relations, and famously Jordan, Egypt being some of these countries that really allowed the regional solidification of this nation state. They're trying to pressure the Saudi deal kind of like in that same light as some way to try and ease tensions. What's your take? Because it just seems like they're beating their head against a wall, trying to get this through, and I don't understand what seems to be so important right now with this.
Yeah, look, the U.S. Administration on the eve of October 7th, so before the war, before the genocide, they were working on this normalization agreement between the U.S. and between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This was supposed to be, there were rumors that they were at very high level talks, and these were very serious, and there was quite a real chance that there would be normalization. Why? Because I think. Look, this is Biden just doing what Trump did. It's the belief that you can, that you're first of all, that you're kind of like moving the region in the right direction by basically completely ignoring the Palestinians. That you can solve the region's problems. You can create a more peaceful Middle East, a more peaceful Israel-Palestine, if there's broader normalization between Israel and the Arab world. But for decades, the problem has not been Israel and the Arab world. I mean, again, if you're stuck in 1972, if your frame of mind, suppose you're 80 years old, suppose that you grew up in the 50s and 60s, and that your worldview is of Israel in the 50s and 60s. Well, maybe you might believe that the problem is between Israel and the Arab states, but that has never been the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It never has been, not from day one. That has always been a distraction.
Yeah.
The real problem has always been Israel and the Palestinians. That has always been the real problem. Always. Even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, even though it was slightly kind of, pushed to the side for, let's say, a decade or two. But that has always been the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
Because Israel has no fundamental problem with Egypt or Syria or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia. There's no conflict over land. But Israel and Egypt don't debate. Israel doesn't desire.
Not yet. No.
Okay, the Shiba farms. I mean, there's these little territorial disputes. But
yeah.
On the grand scheme of things, obviously, Israel wants all of Palestine and has the power to take it and has the desire to take it and is currently taking it. That's the crux of the issue from the late 19th century all the way to the present. And so everyone focusing on these normalization deals is just adding to the decades-long distraction of ignoring the Palestinians. And if you ignore the Palestinians, you get October 7th. If you lock them into a cage, and throw away the key, and basically let them, live a completely hopeless life, living in an open-air prison with no opportunities, and starve them and basically put them on a diet. That was the Israeli terminology, right? You allow just enough calories in so they don't starve to death, based on the belief that the world wouldn't let Israel actually starve them to death. By the way, that proved to be wrong.
Right.
But if you just lock them up and throw away the key, well, then you've solved the problem. Well, you haven't.
This idea that you can just continue this on and it's not obvious as to what's happening. The gaslighting coming out of Israel, the spokespeople, the Biden administration, the amount of State Department officials that have left specifically on this issue. I don't know that's ever even happened during the Obama administration and increasing drone warfare. No one cared. And these are people who have been there for decades. I don't know. It just seems like, you said the order, the geopolitical order is shifting in ways that are scary a lot of times. We got about 5 minutes. I want to be respectful of your time. What can people do to help? Where do you think the regular person watching this right now, where can they put their best effort to help Palestinians?
It's a very context dependent answer, right? Because student has a different has would do something different than someone who works at a company, who would do something different than someone who is a elected official, who would do something different than who is the CEO of a company, who would do so, etc. So, I would say
I think
you have to leverage.
I got mostly students and or workers in here. So no, if there's any CEOs, you better start subbing a little bit more. But
Okay, so I mean, basically, you have to leverage your own particular skill set, your own particular community. So if you're because I think what's critical is that we all press on the lever points that we have access to, right? If you're a student, well, then your university probably is invested in a lot of things, companies that are profiting off Israeli genocide in Gaza. If you work at a big company, then your company may well be profiting off of the mass murder of Palestinians. If you let's say are living in a big city, you can probably go to a protest. If you have a big audience on social media, well, then you can influence a lot of people's opinions. So it really just depends on your position in society and your place in the world. There's no right or wrong way to speak up, or protest, or demand that your government takes action, or demand that your university divest, or demand that your company stop profiting off mass murder of Palestinians, right? But what I'm saying is there's a million and one ways to be an advocate, be a voice for freedom and human rights. And I would just encourage everyone, and also, by the way, it's not that everyone has an equal desire to write or to post or to protest. Maybe I like to write, think pieces. Maybe I just like to share stuff. Maybe I like to get out to the streets. It just depends on your own personal inclination. So again, there's no right or wrong way to be an advocate, but and so I would just encourage everyone to do what they can, what's within their means, what's within their abilities, what's within their skill sets, and what's within their interests.
And also subscribe to Palestinian Nexus. See there, you add the ad right there at the bottom. But no, I appreciate that because it is a sentiment of a truth that, like, I think sometimes gets lost. I've been able to attend some of these protests in DC. I'm kind of curious, as a hefty academic, which I apologize not calling you doctor, but what's your opinion of the student protests? Have you been connected to any of other fellow alumni, like student groups or anything like that? What is your impression of these encampments? That UCLA was still going last night.
Yeah, look, they're incredibly inspiring. I mean, my God, when I was an undergraduate student, I'm dating myself here. So, but back in the day, this is 2004. It was a BDS resolution that was put forward before the student government, and it was overwhelmingly rejected by the students. So 20 years. So just look where we've come in 20 years. Not only did we see a complete 180, we saw a complete. Not only did we see a complete flip in the average student government position, but now we have the largest protest encampment we've had since the Vietnam War. I mean, we've made a tremendous amount of progress. It's incredibly inspiring what is happening. They are doing more to bring light on the issue than has been brought by almost anyone, really since October 7th. Because the media had stopped talking about it for a few months, and then we had the protests.
Yeah.
And that reignited the conversation. God bless all their souls, and they're on the front lines. They're being beaten. The police are coming and beating the living hell out of them. The students at the University of Michigan, they got sprayed with pepper spray in their eyes. They had to be hospitalized. The students at Columbia, you have they're spraying skunk water on them. They're being hospitalized.
The NYPD, they brought out all sorts of anti-terror, military vehicles for college students in a building, and this is where it's very insane to me to see people talking about they need to stop the violence on campus, and you've got people in tents, right, and then you've got ironclad billy club helmets, riot shields, and where's the violence on these two sides? At least there's a large portion of America that's very still blind to the fact that it is the cops that they are the ones committing violence. And especially too with some of these protests or anti-protesters, which, I mean, some of the most racist stuff that I've seen caught on camera towards black people have been at some of these protests. And it's very insane to see. This might be my last question. Everything is seen through the lens of the U.S. election. I think there's a lot of progressives or a lot of people who, if not for, having a Democrat in the White House, would probably be more outspoken. There's this fear of, oh, you're going to get Trump elected and, it's going to make things worse. Is there any response that you have to that? I've got my own takes that you might take by the side, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like Trump is better than Biden on Israel-Palestine. No, he's worse in some ways, but actually he may be better in other ways. Because what happens when Trump is in the White House is that there's no longer any facade. It's the curtain is taken away.
Yeah,
he's very direct. He says exactly, whatever David Friedman and Kushner and Greenblatt and all these basically fascist pro-Israeli settlers believe. That Biden at least puts on this facade of, oh, I'm going to pause weapons deliveries for 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Oh, Israel needs to do more to protect civilians. So there's this facade, which then convinces some percentage of the American public that, wow, Biden's really working hard for the Palestinians, which is obviously total nonsense. So in some ways, the facade is dangerous. And with Trump, there's no facade. It's the same policy, just without the facade.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I actually think there's a very easy argument to make here that it's the facade that's the true danger. And it's as long as and when to remove the facade, the immunity systems of progressives and liberals will kick in.
Yeah.
And you need those immunities to kick in. And they do not kick in so long as there is this fiction that is being upheld that Biden is somehow doing something to prevent the genocide. No, he's not. He's actively supporting it. He's complicit in it. Every red line is a fiction of a red line. It's just white smoke and mirrors. There's no actual preventing of any type of genocidal act. It's just he's all in on the genocide is basically what there is to say about it. So, I mean, in some ways, there's an argument to be made that if you want to end the genocide, you actually should vote for Trump.
Which I'm hoping, there's some type of pressure that can be leveraged to at least just recognize the state. Because this is something that is very nonsensical as to not being able to recognize, an amorphous state, right? Because someone show me where the borders of Israel are, right? There are there is a borderless state that is Israel. There's something that there was dedicated borders. There's borders that exist as far as where the fences are, and then there's borders of where the extent of settler violence can reach. Do you think recognizing the state of Palestine on the world stage in a full capacity, do you think that would actually give some type of stability and actually push the situation forward in a positive way?
Well, if it, we just saw, was it Ireland, Spain, and is it Norway or Finland or whoever it was that, said that we recognize Palestine as a state. Of course, Palestine is not a state. A state is an entity that has monopoly over the use of force within its borders. And obviously, Palestinians do not have a monopoly over the use of force within their borders. The Israeli military does. But if these countries were actually serious about recognizing Palestine, great, recognize Palestine, and then take the necessary actions that would follow from that statement of recognition, which is that this state is being occupied, militarily occupied by a foreign army, and therefore you need to impose sanctions on that foreign military for militarily occupying an independent state, just like you've done it with Russia and Ukraine. So if you want to do it, then do it. But what bothers me is you make the declaration of recognition. Again, it's a facade. You're not actually doing anything other than saying a few words to pretend that you're doing something, but you're actually doing nothing.
Do you feel that it moves the issue at all, or is this just, hey, this is going to quench some protests in my nation state and allow us to kind of move into the EU elections and actually get a W? Because it seems like that's for Spain, at least, that for their left party is they, made a decision on Palestine, able to hold and actually, gain some seats and stuff like that. Which not bad, I guess, like for the internal politics of Spain. But what does this actually mean for Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, look, in general, I think it's good that people bring attention to the issue. In general, I think it's good people are talking about Palestine. If people can make those declarations in the service of helping win an election for a progressive cause, that then great. Like I'm not saying these are any. I'm not saying these are bad things. I'm not. No, they're better than nothing.
Yeah, but they're not,
But
obviously. Yeah.
you're not actually changing the situation on the ground in Palestine by those statements.
And short of actually having third party military, which I think China had mentioned a proposal of having UN peacekeepers. I mean, I'm not so sure anything short of kind of like post World War II Japan treatment of like complete dearmament of the Israeli government would do anything. Anything less than that would be able to satisfy actually stopping the violence. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, you do need a complete removal of the current governing coalition and a complete disarmament of the Israeli military. I agree. I don't see any other way down the violence.
Well, let's get on it. No, that's the difficult part. Zach, I'm out of questions, but I do really, really appreciate your time and you coming and speak with me and to the audience as well. Can you just talk about the project, how long you've been working on it, where things are going from here?
Yeah, hey, thanks for bringing that up. I run a website called Palestine Nexus, PalestineNexus.com. We have a digital archive which includes maps of Palestine, historical maps. It also includes many documents, including a large collection of documents we retrieved from Gaza, as well as other documents related to Palestinian history, and more broadly the history of the Middle East. We also have a newsletter. So every week we publish a newsletter on Palestine, and Stephanie does the audio for that. So we've got an audio version if you prefer audio, and also we launched a course recently. So if you're interested in kind of 5 hours of, let's say, my best content on Palestine, Israel, the history of that Israel-Palestine question, you can sign up for that on PalestineNexus.com. You'll see a link there for the courses, and you can just sign up and access that. We do monthly kind of Ask Me Anythings where, anyone can just jump on and sort of ask any question they have about what's happening. And yeah, we're trying to grow and we're trying to, move into new formats. Now we have a YouTube. Like I said, we have the audio, we have the newsletter, and, hopefully we'll be expanding. So, yeah, you can follow us at, PalestineNexus.com.
Well, and thank you so much, and hopefully we could have you back. I do want to say stay as safe as you can, and really thank you for all the work that you've done, throughout your career, but especially now, as this world is kind of seen, especially this issue in a whole different light, and people have documented and done the research and to actually like express the true facts on the ground, which I shouldn't even say that saying. It's but to actually to show the facts as they are. So thank you, Zach. And yeah, hopefully we'll talk soon.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Marcus.
All right, have a good one.